Have you ever stopped to think that sometimes the perfect crime isn't the one no one sees, but the one everyone sees and yet can't explain? That's what we're going to talk about today. And before we begin, I'm going to ask you, are you subscribed to the channel? If not, click here to subscribe, like and comment. That way you help me continue bringing you investigations that will turn your mind upside down. Today's story is about a theft that defied logic, ridiculed technology, and humiliated experts. A heavy, valuable, and impossible-to-miss object simply disappeared without leaving a single mark on the ground. Nothing. Not a drag, not a footprint, not a single speck of dust out of place. A mystery so absurd that if it weren't real, you'd swear it was made up for a movie. And the most disturbing thing? This crime didn't begin in the early hours of the morning of the robbery. It began days before, in plain sight, in a setting where every detail seemed to be in place. This is where the counterintuitive part comes in. The safer we believe ourselves to be, the more vulnerable we become to those who know our flaws. And in this case, whoever planned it knew exactly where they all were. Today, you'll step into my shoes, feel the weight of each clue, and see how an impossible crime can be solved when you learn to see what others overlook. But be careful. After this story, you'll never look at a safe place the same way again. Have you ever come across something that seems to carry more history than the museum itself? Well, when I first saw the Heart of Tarshish, I felt exactly that. A volcanic sculpture, heavy as the truth many don't want to face, and with a past that seemed more like a collection of diplomatic sins. They said it came from a temple that disappeared in the 13th century. But the original documentation had more holes than Swiss cheese. And in my work, every hole is an invitation to delve deeper. The curious thing is that the heart wasn't just an object. It was almost a living character in the crime scene. It had no eyes but seemed to observe passers-by. It had no mouth but seemed to whisper secrets that only a few could understand. And like every good story, this artifact had already sparked heated debates at conferences, auctions, and diplomatic meetings. Some saw it as sacred heritage, others merely a piece of stone with inflated value. The truth, as always, was hidden beneath layers of narrative. Didn't take long for me to realize that the piece had a kind of energy of its own. And I'm not talking about cheap mysticism. It was something more subtle, a power to attract attention, to become a focal point for politicians, collectors, and criminals. In my experience, anything that attracts this much attention will sooner or later end up at the center of a dangerous plot. And I was about to discover that the heart not only attracted eyes, but also very skilled hands. That week, a rumor began to circulate through the halls. Someone was willing to do anything to get that sculpture. Anything is a phrase that, to most, sounds like an exaggeration. To me, it sounded like a warning, and it was in this atmosphere, amidst murmurs and sidelong glances, that I realized something big was about to happen. And the Heart of Tarsus was right in the eye of this silent hurricane. But you still don't know how it disappeared without leaving a single mark on the floor. If there's one thing I've learned in my years of research, it's that an object's true value rarely lies in what it is, but in what people believe it to be. The Heart of Tarshish had just been revalued after a similar piece sold at an international auction for a price that would make any banker choke on their champagne. The insurer tripled the premium, and the museum proudly plastered the figure across its advertising campaign. It was like shouting to the world, "Hey, this is worth millions, and it's right here in front of you." And you know what happens when you shine such a bright spotlight on a treasure, right? It stops being just a piece and becomes a trophy. An irresistible temptation for thieves who aren't content with wallets and watches. In these cases, it doesn't matter whether the thief is after quick cash or quiet glory. The effect is the same. The risk increases, and reaction time needs to be calculated like a chess player already 3 moves ahead. The ironic part is that the more valuable a piece becomes, the more complex the web of interest surrounding it becomes. Rival collectors, foreign galleries, exotic tycoons, all curiously interested. And each new interested party is also a potential informant, accomplice, or even the criminal in disguise. I've seen cases where the insured himself staged the theft to collect on the policy. It's a dirty game, but with sums like that, no one plays fair. So when I received the news of the reassessment and the increased insurance coverage, something inside me clicked. It was like seeing a match flicker in the dark. A small flame, but with the potential to burn down an entire forest. The heart was now worth more than ever. And this value not only attracted attention, but also accelerated invisible clocks. And from what I was about to discover, the time on that clock was already close to zero. The museum where the Heart of Tarsus rested was not just a modern building. It was a fortress disguised as a temple of art. Vast skylights let in daylight as if it were a divine gift. But at night they became enormous, blind eyes staring skyward. The marble floor was so polished that it reflected every footstep, every speck of dust in the air. And it was precisely on this floor that any footprint, no matter how small, would betray an intruder. It was perfect, until the night it left no trace. The main gallery was in the center of the building, with technical walkways suspended over 6 meters in the air, used only for maintenance. The access doors were locked with electronic locks, monitored by proximity sensors, and security cameras seemed to cover every angle. But I already knew cameras never show everything. There's always a blind spot, whether due to shadow, reflection, malicious intent. And in this museum, the reflection of the marble offered one of those subtle hiding places. Nighttime security was organized like a Swiss watch. Patrols every 20 minutes, sensors calibrated to detect any shift in weight on the pedestal, and an alarm system that could wake up the neighboring town. Apparently nothing would go unnoticed inside, but as I always say, security systems are like padlocks. They serve more to deter amateurs than to stop a determined professional. That night, the museum seemed asleep, unaware that someone was about to rewrite its history. The silent walls, soft lights, and spotless floor hid a cruel truth. The enemy was already inside, moving with frightening confidence. How, after all, could someone carry a 200-kilogram object without leaving a single trace on the floor? Well, that was the question that would keep me awake for weeks to come. In my profession, I've learned that routine is both an ally and a trap. At the museum, it was practically sacred. Every night, the glass dome protecting the Heart of Tarsus was locked by a high-powered magnetic system, something not even an angry weightlifter could force open. Proximity sensors surrounded the pedestal like invisible sentries, and any unauthorized approach would trigger deafening alarms. At least, that's how it was on paper. The night patrols followed an unchanging pattern. 3,000, 320, 340, always like that, like the beat of a repetitive song. And here's the problem. When you know the rhythm, you can predict the intervals of silence. Good criminals don't force entry. They dance to the beat of security, seizing the time between one step and the next to act. And from what I saw later, whoever took the heart knew that rhythm better than some guards. The camera system also had its own choreography. They moved in a programmed cycle, covering one sector at a time. But there was a treacherous reflection on the polished marble that created a small dead zone in the footage. It wasn't much, but enough for someone to move quickly without being detected. A nearly invisible detail, but to trained eyes it's like an open invitation. On this particular night, everything was business as usual. Guards circulated, cameras swiveled, sensors flashing green lights, until at 3:12 a.m., the alarm system went off. 4 minutes later, the team arrived at the gallery and found the pedestal empty, the dome intact, and most impressively, no marks on the floor. It was at that moment that I realized the real danger isn't when security fails. It's when it works perfectly, and yet something goes missing. The chronology of a crime is like the skeleton of a body. If you understand its structure, you can reconstruct the rest. In the case of the Heart of Tarsus, the skeleton began at 3:12 a.m., when the alarm sounded. Before that, everything was quiet, at least as far as official records were concerned. The patrols indicated normality. The cameras showed nothing unusual. But I knew that the calm before the storm never comes without a price. 4 minutes after the alarm went off, at 3:16 a.m., the security team arrived at the gallery, and it was like entering a stage after the final act. The protagonist had disappeared, but the scenery remained untouched. The pedestal was empty, the dome in place, and there were no signs of forced entry. No footprints, no dragging, nothing to reveal how 200 kilograms of sculpture had evaporated into thin air. When I overlaid the camera times, I noticed an unsettling detail. Between 3:09 and 3:11, there was a strange flicker in the image from 2 nearby cameras. Nothing that would crash the system, but a brief blink, as if someone knew exactly how to trigger a momentary glitch without arousing suspicion. This, coupled with the precise timing between patrols, suggested the criminal wasn't just improvising. He was executing a meticulously timed plan. And that's when a question began to haunt me. If the crime was so quick, so clean, and so well orchestrated, then the thief not only knew the museum's routine, but had perhaps already rehearsed it inside. And to confirm this, I'd need to look far beyond the footprints that weren't there. Moving a 200-kilogram object without leaving a trace on the ground. At first glance, it seems like a magic trick. But in my line of work, I don't believe in magic. I believe in method. If there were no footprints, no drag marks, and the pedestal remained intact, there were only two logical explanations. Either the sculpture was removed from above or from below. Any other hypothesis was pure fantasy. I began by analyzing the possibility of aerial access. The technical walkways on the ceiling could, in theory, allow someone to hoist the heart, but its weight and size made this a huge logistical challenge. Furthermore, the ceiling had vibration sensors that, in theory, would detect any unusual movement. The problem is that sensors like guards can be convinced to close their eyes when someone knows how to move in the right places. The other hypothesis was an underground access. The marble floor hid a technical space used for electrical and plumbing maintenance. It would be possible to raise the heart from below, but this would require prior preparation and considerable time. No thief comes in with a sledgehammer and starts breaking up the floor without attracting attention. In other words, if it was from below, someone had done the heavy lifting days, perhaps weeks before. This dilemma reminded me of an old case I investigated, in which a safe was robbed without touching the lock. The secret was to bypass the lock and enter through the false ceiling. And looking at the heart of Tarsus, I smelled the same scent of criminal creativity in the air. The question was no longer whether it was from above or below, but rather who knew how to use these routes as if they were hallways in their own house. When there are no footprints, you learn to look for what the lazy eye misses. That's how I noticed small vertical scratches on the base of the pedestal, as if something heavy had been pulled upward. They weren't deep marks, but enough to tell a story. The heart wasn't carried out, it was hoisted. It was such a subtle detail that even a distracted janitor would have brushed it off, literally. Additionally, I found a metallic grain stuck in a crevice near the top edge of the dome. It wasn't ordinary dust, it had a different shine and density. A quick preliminary analysis indicated it was a fragment of some kind of pulley or technical cable. This was music to my ears. After all, every particle out of place is like a word out of context. It indicates that something isn't right. But what intrigued me most was a halo of displaced dust, almost spiraling, on the surface of the pedestal. This pattern was unnatural. It appeared to be the result of forcefully displaced air, as if a piece of equipment had generated turbulence when being removed. This reinforced the hypothesis that a hoisting system or winch was in operation at the time of the crime. The curious thing is that all this only became apparent because I knew exactly where to look. To many, the pedestal was clean. To me, it was an open diary, with pages written in code that only a trained eye could read. And this diary whispered that whoever did it had experience working at heights, and perhaps even access to equipment you wouldn't find in just any store. If there's one thing that differentiates a common crime from an ingenious one, it's the way the environment speaks without opening its mouth. I pulled up the HVAC records and nearly fell out of my chair. At 3:10 a.m., a sudden drop in pressure coursed through the system, as if someone had opened an invisible window in the building's lungs. 2 minutes later, a power surge at 3:11 a.m., just before the alarm went off. Coincidence? In investigations, coincidence is just a fancy way of saying I haven't connected the dots yet. So let's connect them. I'd seen this symphony before. Pressure drops, air changes direction, dust dances in the darkness. When powerful equipment starts, especially an electric winch or a motorized pulley system, the air betrays the movement. The spiraling halo of dust on the pedestal didn't appear out of nowhere. It was blown by a localized gust, the kind a compact turbine might produce. And guess what? The high grate, high up in the gallery, revealed residue that clashed with the museum's almost surgically cleanliness. I cross-referenced electrical logs with the circuit map and found a sigh in the secondary power panel. A short, concentrated draw, as if someone had temporarily bypassed it. Nothing excessive enough to crash the system, just enough to power a silent motor for 30 or 40 seconds. That's enough time to lift 200 kilos with surgical calm. Have you ever seen a juggler whose hands don't shake? So the signature here is someone who practices first, tests later, and performs without rushing. Now, Get this. The airflow in the duct above the skylight was reversed at that moment, an accordion effect caused by a localized obstruction. Translation for those who don't live in mechanical rooms. Someone positioned equipment and took up space in the duct, creating a hiccup in the system. This hiccup coincided with the oscillation of the cameras between 309 and 311. Air, electricity, and video singing in unison. When three distinct systems tell the same story, my instinct tells me that all that's left is to find the stage set, and it was, I suspect, lower than everyone imagined, starting with the pedestal that pretended to be merely decorative. Most people look at a pedestal and see nothing more than a base to support something valuable. With years of field experience, I see a possible silent accomplice. In the case of the Heart of Tarsus, this pedestal had an uncomfortable peculiarity. It was heavy and sturdy, but with an almost imperceptible millimeter gap between the base and the floor. The kind of detail that, if you're not trained, goes unnoticed. But for me, it was like seeing a scar on a face that supposedly has never been injured. When I crouched down to inspect, I noticed something even more revealing. The screws holding the pedestal to the floor bore recent retightening marks. The right wrench leaves a specific pattern on the screw head, and these marks were fresh. This meant someone had not only tampered with the pedestal, but had done so calmly, days before the theft. It was like setting the stage for a very expensive play. This preparation couldn't have been a coincidence. The pedestal, by all indications, had been adapted to allow the piece to be removed from below, without the need to move the object horizontally. Perhaps a quick release mechanism, perhaps a false bottom. The point is, it was rigged in advance, and such advanced preparation would only have been possible if the criminal had authorized access to the site, or at least the trust of someone who did. I stood there, staring at that silent block, thinking about how many crimes I've seen originate in the preparation phase. It's like cooking. The dish only comes together quickly because all the work was done beforehand behind the scenes. And here the scenes were already set up. The pedestal wasn't just a prop, it was the trapdoor to a trick. A trick that, if I followed the clues, would lead me directly to the mastermind. When a crime is as clean as the theft of the Heart of Tarsus, the suspect list doesn't din with who could have done it, but with who had motive. And here the cast of characters was worthy of a detective novel. First, the curator, passionate about the piece, but pressured by the museum's board to increase visitor numbers. A high-profile theft could transform the heart into a myth and, in the process, attract worldwide attention. Next came the restorer, a man who understood every crack and grain of that sculpture. He'd recently lost funding for a personal project, and there's nothing like a well-planned crime to reverse a bad tide or to exact revenge on whoever cut your funding. Next came the IT technician, who coincidentally managed the cameras and knew which ones were down for maintenance. With a few clicks, he could create convenient blackout windows. The ceiling contractor also made the list. He had legitimate access to the walkways and skylight, and his recent maintenance work could have served as cover for installing lifting equipment. Last but not least, the veteran security guard, a trustworthy man with years of impeccable service and mounting debts that could make him a perfect candidate to sell to the highest bidder. Each of these names carried a different weight, and everyone knew how the museum breathed. But the question that lingered was who among them would have the courage and nerve to execute something so precise. I knew the answer lay in a tiny detail, and that the next step would be to separate the innocent from those who were merely pretending. The Heart of Tarsus wasn't just a museum piece, it was a magnet for controversy. Cultural activists called for the sculpture's return to its country of origin, claiming it had been illegally removed during a scientific expedition in the last century. At the same time, the press seized on every detail of this dispute to fuel inflammatory headlines, questioning not only the legality of its ownership, but also the ethics of displaying it in a foreign territory. These disputes alone created fertile ground for a cinematic theft. International pressure and the tense climate meant that any disappearance of the piece would be interpreted as a political act, not just a criminal one. This meant that if it were stolen by activists, the heart might never return, and if it were stolen by a common criminal, the public outcry could serve as a smokescreen for its escape. Behind the scenes, museum sponsors were beginning to worry. The mere possibility of the piece being targeted for retaliation was causing many to reconsider their support. After all, associating one's brand with an artifact shrouded in controversy could be as dangerous as it was lucrative, and for a cunning thief, There's nothing better than an environment where everyone has something to lose and therefore something to hide. It was this external noise that bothered me. I knew that, amidst this storm of opinions and interests, any clue could be distorted, muffled, or even fabricated. And if the true perpetrator of the crime was someone capable of manipulating this chaos, well then we would be facing an adversary who played not just with his hands but with the minds of all of us. In crimes like these, the real thief rarely lets you follow their direct trail. They prefer to plant false footprints, like someone throwing breadcrumbs to lead the hunter in the wrong direction. And in the case of the Heart of Tarsus, these breadcrumbs came in the form of clues too flashy to be genuine. The first was an anonymous ransom note left on the museum's bulletin board. Cheap paper, a common pen, and a melodramatic tone worthy of a detective novel. The second gift was even bolder, 24 hours after the theft. A photo of the heart, allegedly in the possession of an international gang, surfaced on the dark web. The image quickly circulated among collectors and curious individuals, igniting social media and fueling wild theories. But a closer look revealed that the photo was a crude montage created from an official image available on the museum's own website. These distractions act as smokescreens. While the press, the public, and even some investigators were busy pursuing these clues, the real perpetrator gained precious time to cover his tracks and solidify his escape plan. It's an old trick, but still effective, giving the world something to watch while the real act unfolds in the dark. What intrigued me was the sophistication of the theater. It wasn't just about inventing side stories, but about creating narratives believable enough to share resources and attention. And when a criminal masters the art of making you chase the wind, it's a sign they're always 2 steps ahead, and that perhaps the next false lead was already being planted right under my nose. Often, the difference between a cold case and a solved one lies in looking at the obvious with suspicion. That's exactly what led me to use a resource few colleagues would consider: 3D dust displacement modeling. Using laser scanning technology, I captured every inch of the pedestal in the surrounding area. I then digitally recreated the scene, including particles suspended in the air at the time the security team arrived. The results were revealing. By simulating the dust flow, I noticed that the particles formed a directional pattern, like an invisible trail pointing upward. The origin of this movement wasn't the ground, but rather a ventilation grill positioned nearly 5 meters high at the top of the gallery. It was as if air had been pulled there during the robbery, confirming the hypothesis of a vertical lift. The most striking thing was that the air displacement couldn't have been caused by simple human movement. Creating that pattern would have required equipment with controlled force, something you can't improvise in the heat of the moment. This reinforced my suspicion that the crime had been rehearsed in advance, with the equipment discreetly installed days before. And as I analyzed this data, a nagging thought occurred to me. If the thief had the time and freedom to assemble all this without arousing suspicion, then he not only knew the museum's routine, he moved around inside as if it were his own home. And that, my friend, drastically narrowed the suspect pool. Following instinct, I decided it was time to switch from logical reasoning to forensic work. I ordered a full microfiber sweep, and that's how I found something that seemed insignificant. A synthetic filament, discreetly attached to the edge of the skylight, too small to be seen with the naked eye, but large enough to be a criminal's signature. The lab confirmed my suspicions. It was a specific type of fiber used in high-strength technical ropes, common in industrial mountaineering and structural maintenance. It wasn't something you'd buy on the corner. It required specialized suppliers. What's more, that exact color of filament was only used by a company recently contracted for services at the museum. This discovery opened a new trail. If the equipment came from such a specific source, tracing who had access to it would be relatively easy. And as a bonus, it could identify not only the perpetrator of the crime but also who was behind it, providing the means and instructions for its execution. After all, in planned crimes, the supplier of the key tool is rarely completely innocent. As I stared at that tiny fiber, I couldn't help but smile. I've seen entire cases solved by details as subtle as this. And this time, that thread wasn't just a clue. It was the rope that, if pulled carefully, could dismantle the entire theater and reveal who was pulling the curtains backstage. Alibis, for me, have always been like jewelry store windows, shiny on the outside, but fragile when you know where to knock. The curator, for example, swore she was at a social event the night of the robbery. Indeed, there were photos of her smiling alongside guests. But the image's metadata told a different story. The upload was hours later, allowing the photos to be taken at any time before publication. It was a pretty alibi, but the glass was starting to crack. The IT technician claimed to be at home broadcasting a gaming live stream. However, analyzing the stream, I discovered a detail most would overlook. The chat interacted with unusual delays, indicating the content could have been pre-recorded. In other words, while everyone thought he was in front of a screen, he could very well have been in front of the pedestal. The ceiling contractor didn't even have a polished alibi. His electronic badge registered an entry into the museum during the early hours of the morning, something he tried to explain away as a system error. The problem is that the access control logs were as precise as a scalpel and coincided exactly with the HESAC pressure drop and the electrical surge detected. A coincidence that in my book means only one thing: a lie. The pattern was beginning to form. All the prime suspects had alibis, but none of them were proof against Jonh Spencer. The trick now was no longer figuring out who was lying, but who had the control to coordinate so many lies at once. And that would lead me to an even more uncomfortable revelation. With all the pieces on the table, the image began to take shape. The heart of Tarsus wasn't pushed or carried. It was hoisted from above, using a traction system prepared days before. The adapted pedestal, the vertical markings, the synthetic fiber in the skylight. Everything converged on the same method: controlled vertical removal, without touching the floor. This explained the complete absence of footprints. The floor was never part of the journey. The plan required more than courage. It required early access, technical expertise, and synchronization with the security system's natural flaws. The perpetrator or perpetrators knew that the patrol provided 20-minute windows, that the reflection on the marble created a blind spot, and that a small electrical bypass could power the hoisting motor without triggering overload alarms. This isn't something you learn by watching videos on the internet. It comes from experiencing the situation. The execution was almost surgical. At the right moment, the hidden winch was activated, lifting the sculpture through the skylight or technical walkway. Within seconds, it was above the camera's line of sight, being silently moved to a ceiling or technical duct area. Then, all that was needed was to stop the movement, deliberately let the alarm sound, and disappear, knowing that the first minutes would be chaotic and unproductive for any search. The most disturbing thing about this hypothesis is that it didn't rely on a lone criminal mastermind. It was the kind of operation that could be pulled off by 2 or 3 well-trained accomplices, each in their own role, without the need for real-time communication. And if that were true, it meant I was dealing not with one thief, but with a team that had been rehearsing this scam for much longer than I could have imagined. It was while analyzing old photos of the heart of Tarsus that I noticed something curious. A week before the theft, the sculpture had been rotated about 15 degrees on its pedestal. It wasn't noticeable to the general public, but to me it was a glaring detail. Rotating a piece of that weight isn't the task of a curious visitor. It's the job of someone with access, time, and a reason to test their limits. This small adjustment revealed much more than it seemed. Comparing images from different angles, I realized that the rotation perfectly aligned the sculpture's base with a structural point on the ceiling, the same spot where we found fiber residue and signs of recent use. In other words, the rotation wasn't random. It was a technical rehearsal to ensure that on the day of the crime, the hoisting would be smooth without friction or risk of jamming. It was at that moment that I understood. The robbery that morning didn't begin at 3:12 a.m. It began days earlier, when someone tampered with the piece, tested the pedestal, and prepared the stage for the final act. The night of the crime was just the final scene in a play carefully rehearsed backstage. And like all good theater, there were hidden actors and a director orchestrating every movement. The problem was, until then, I still didn't know who the conductor of this silent opera was. But I was about to find out, and the answer wouldn't come from a lit stage, but from a dark corner where only those who truly know the script enter. In an investigation, evidence is like dominoes. Sometimes all it takes is knocking over the right one for the whole sequence to fall. And that's exactly what happened when I received the report on a strange material found on the gloves of one of the suspects. The sealing contract. The test detected silicone sealant residue, the same type and composition used on the gallery skylight. This coincidence would be weak in isolation, but it became overwhelming when combined with the electrical panel logs. I discovered that, just minutes before the alarm, there had been unauthorized access to the power panel in the area where Corazon was located. The electronic log pointed to the contractor's badge. He tried to claim the card had been lost, but he couldn't explain why the same badge had registered entries and exits within the exact time frame of the robbery. Cross-analysis of schedules, electrical consumption, and HVAC data placed the contractor at the epicenter of the crime. More than that, he had the technical skill, the equipment, and the perfect cover to operate without arousing suspicion. After all, who questions a man who's supposedly just fixing something on the ceiling? It was at this point that the pieces began to fall into place, almost painfully. The contractor wasn't just a supporting character, he was the physical link connecting the plan to its execution. And if he was involved, then the next step would be to find out who he shared the stage with. Because a coup of this magnitude is rarely written by two people. The final confrontation didn't take place in an interrogation room, but in a remote warehouse, where the contractor believed he was safe. I already knew he hadn't acted alone, but I wanted to hear from him. Who else was part of the plan? And as I always say, when you corner someone with incontrovertible evidence, their resistance doesn't last long. It only took a few minutes and a few printed photos for him to start talking. The confession revealed what I already suspected. He had worked side by side with the veteran security guard, the one who knew every shadow and silence in the museum. Together, they rehearsed the scam for weeks, disguising the steps as routine repairs. The winch was installed piece by piece, and the pedestal was prepared in broad daylight, under the indifferent gaze of those who thought it was just preventative maintenance. Locating the heart of Tarsus was almost anticlimactic after that. The piece was hidden in the technical ceiling of an adjacent wing, packaged and protected, ready for removal sometime in the future. The first part of the plan was to disappear the artifact to create a stir and buy time. The second was to sell it discreetly on the black market once the dust had settled. As I watched the sculpture being removed from its hiding place, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief at closing the case. Frustration at knowing that if not for a few tiny details, they would have succeeded. And it was there, in the heavy silence of the warehouse, that I realized a good thief plans a crime. An exceptional thief plans the story everyone will tell after him. Cases like the Heart of Tarsus leave their mark far beyond the final report. They teach, and teach dearly. The first lesson is obvious to any investigator who has ever gotten their hands dirty. When the ground speaks silence, look up. In security, the absence of evidence never means an absence of action. Often it's a sign that someone knew where to act to leave no trace. The second lesson is about correlation. Air, electricity, and dust told the same story before any suspect opened their mouth. The synchronization between seemingly independent systems, HVAC, cameras, and electrical panel, was what exposed the hidden script. It's like putting together a puzzle without a reference image. You have to trust the shape of the pieces more than the picture you expect to see. The third is that well-executed crimes begin long before the moment of the robbery. The preparation, the rehearsal, the subtle infiltration, all of this builds the invisible foundation upon which the final act is built. Those who learn to recognize these signs in everyday life can foresee problems before they occur, whether in a museum, a company, or in life itself. And finally, the most uncomfortable lesson: the greatest risks don't come from outside, but from within. Those who understand the routine, the blind spots, and the weaknesses of a system are the ones who can use them against you. And this truth, my friend, applies as much to protecting a multi-million-dollar artifact as it does to protecting the most valuable pieces of your own history. If there's one thing this case taught me, and that you can apply to your life, it's that true security lies not in the walls you build, but in the eyes you keep open. The theft of the Heart of Tarsus was a brutal reminder that the greatest risks come from where we least expect them. And if this applies to artifacts worth millions, it also applies to your decisions, your projects, and even who you let into your life. Now tell me, what would you do if you had to protect something valuable without being able to trust anyone? Can you identify the loopholes around you, or do you still believe you're 100% safe? Think about it. Because often, it's in absolute certainty that silent danger lurks. I want you to use what you've seen here to start looking at the world differently. Analyze patterns, question the obvious, and never ignore the detail that seems too small to matter. That's how I found the thief, and that's how you can find the answers you seek to your own challenges. And of course, if this story opened your mind and made you reflect, subscribe to the channel, turn on notification, and leave your comment. I want to know what details surprised you most about this investigation, and maybe your insights will help me with my next case.